But welcome everybody. This is the third in our series of four webinars that we're doing this fall in partnership with the Tahoe Cattlemen's Association. And really want to thank TCA for helping put these on. And it's been really a great partnership, I think. We've got a couple of TCA board members on the call tonight. Greg Lawley, who you'll be hearing from here in just a little bit. Judd Tripp and Jeff Carroll and Jackie Davis are all on the call. So thank you all for stepping up and helping put these together. And we've got another good night tonight. I want to give you a little bit of introduction. If you have questions, please go ahead and put them in the chat box, and we'll be watching the chat box as we go through the evening to answer your questions. If you can mute your audio, that would be great. It'll help with bandwidth and help make sure we can hear everybody. I will be doing a video of this presentation like we've done on the last two, and I will post that on the Foothill Ranching YouTube site probably tomorrow, Monday at the latest. I'll also be sending out an evaluation to everybody that's on tonight to get your feedback on what went well and what we can improve. Also want to just highlight before we get started here that we've got a couple of additional webinars next week. On the 27th, we'll have a Business of Targeted Grazing webinar that's really focused on getting paid to graze for vegetation management, but I would encourage you to check that out as well. On October 28th, we have an informational meeting on the business of, or on Ranchers Fire Safe Council. We'll have presentations from the California Cattlemen's Association, from somebody who has worked with Rangeland Fire Protection Associations, and then also from a local Watershed and Fire Safe Council. And then on the 29th, we have a beef nutrition webinar with Dr. Pedro Carvalho from UC Davis, who's the new feedlot specialist there. So be sure to check those out as well. And I think we'll go ahead and get started. Are there any questions before we start here? All right. Well, I want to absolutely thank Joe Fisher and Greg Lawley, who have graciously agreed to be on the program tonight. I think we've got two ranchers that I really look up to in terms of their grazing management and pasture management practices, and really thank you guys for being on. So with that, we'll run through a few slides real quick just to provide everybody with a little bit of background on grazing management. And for those of you that haven't joined our past webinars, just a quick introduction of me. I'm the Livestock and Natural Resources Advisor for Pasture, Nevada, Sutter, and Yuba counties, and also have a small pasture and rangeland-based sheep operation here in Auburn. So I'll be talking from the standpoint of both my experience as a farm advisor and then from my experience in managing our own sheep operation. So to give you a little bit of overview tonight, I'm going to talk about the 5 really important grazing management principles that I think will help step up the grazing game. We'll talk a little bit about the difference between rangeland and irrigated pasture, because I think that's another important factor that, particularly for folks just starting out, sometimes are a little different. And then we'll talk to Greg and to Joe about their perspectives on actually implementing these and what works and what doesn't.
Okay.
And if you could mute your audio, that would be great. We're getting some, see if I can find, we're getting some feedback on here.
Okay, mute.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so the first management principle that I really want to talk about is matching supply and demand. So when we think about stocking rate and carrying capacity, we want to really think about not only what the ranch itself runs from one year to the next, but there are some seasonal variations in both stocking rate and carrying capacity. So if we think about stocking rate, that's really the demand side of the equation. That's the number of mouths that we've got to support with our pasture or with our rangeland. But stocking rate varies based on a number of different factors. I think all of us are familiar with the fact that our stocking rate varies by the number and the size and the class of the animals that we've got. That a 1,200-pound cow is going to eat more than a 500-pound heifer, for example. But there's a couple of other factors that we can think about too. Part of that is the time spent grazing. So how long are the animals in a particular place? And how much grazing are they doing? The last factor here, I think, is really important, and it's can be easy to overlook when it comes to stocking rate. But the stage of production really has a bearing on our stocking rate as well. We're finding that a lactating cow is going to consume at least 50% more forage than a dry cow. So I can run the same 100 cows, and when they're dry, they're going to consume only 2/3 of what those lactating cows are going to consume. So the same 100 cows is in essence a higher stocking rate. And I think that's really important for us to keep in mind in terms of our production calendars and monitoring our grazing. On the carrying capacity end of things, that's really the supply side of the equation. And it also varies seasonally and from year to year. So the time of year certainly has an impact on that. You know, the length of the day, the air and soil temperature has an impact on how quickly our grass will grow or whether it's going to grow or not. So we need to take that into account. The productivity of a particular pasture or rangeland site is going to have an impact on that as well. And so we need to account for what that particular pasture or particular field will support. We also need to look at the palatability and the nutritional value of the forage. So the grass that's growing really fast in April and May is going to have much greater palatability and more nutritional value than the dry grass that we've all got in our dry pastures right now. And so understanding that nutritional value is an important piece of carrying capacity too. Forage type is an issue. You know, most of us are used to managing grasses and forbs or broadleaf plants like clover. But any of us that have spent time in the foothills or on Forest Service ground east of us here know that some of those brush pastures can have quite a bit of carrying capacity for cattle too. But we need to account for the forage type. And then definitely climatic conditions have an impact on this. Those of you who, like I did, managed through the 2013-2014 grazing seasons know that grass was pretty tight through April or May and was really pretty tight all year. So part of our job then is to figure out how to match that supply and demand, right? One of the ways that we can estimate carrying capacity is just through historical records. If you've been on a ranch for a long time or if you've leased a ranch and can contact the previous tenant or contact the landowner and find out kind of what that ranch has carried, that's one way to estimate your carrying capacity. Clipping and weighing forage is another way. Joe Fisher and I last year went out and clipped forage on one of the branches that he leases, and that can give us some sense of what the carrying capacity is. It gives us an idea of how much production we've got. Probably the most important thing that we can do as ranchers, though, is really to train our eye. And one of the ways that I've started doing that is to really be diligent about measuring the size of my pastures, tracking how many animals go in there and how long they stay. So from a range science standpoint, I could tell you how many animal unit months I'm harvesting. I don't really track that. I want to know how many days my sheep can stay on that particular pasture. And I want to know how big the pasture is and then track that use. We'll talk a little bit about forage budgets later on, but one of the things I would really encourage you to think about doing is to create a forage budget and a grazing record keeping system so that you can start training your eye and building that long-term knowledge of what your carrying capacity is. The other point, and we'll talk about this here in a couple of slides, that that I think is important to keep in mind here is that intensively managed grazing, like we're going to talk about tonight, can increase your carrying capacity because it increases the efficiency of the grazing. We find in actually looking at this in terms of cattle numbers or sheep numbers, that these types of principles will probably increase your carrying capacity by 25 to 30% over just season-long grazing, just turning the cows out, grazing all season long and coming back to gather them. Like everything else, there's an app for a lot of this, and there are some really good apps for measuring your pasture size or paddock size. We use this app that I've got a screenshot of here called Field Margin because it's available both on my computer and on my phone. It allows us to walk or to drive a pasture boundary and get a pretty accurate estimate of the acreage. But it also allows, if you've got multiple people in your operation, it allows you all to share the same account and share the same information. And so it's a pretty good networking tool as well. Google Earth is another tool to do some measurements on if you're good with that. Measure Map is a phone-based app. Any of you that are hunters may be familiar with the Onyx app, and there's actually a tool in Onyx that allows you to measure parcel size and area. And then there's a fee-for-service app called Pasture Map, which has some really powerful tools in it. It is a little bit more expensive, but that's another way to really keep records on your grazing and on your pasture size. This is just a really simple example of kind of what we record in keeping track of our grazing records. And I can go back over previous year's records and say, last February, I got about 30 sheep days to the acre when we were here. So I know kind of what to budget in terms of how long I can stay in a particular field. But I would encourage you to start thinking about doing this, even if you're just writing it down in a calendar. When you go into a pasture, how many go in and when you come out, because that will really help train your eye. The next piece of this matches to our stocking rate and carrying capacity conversation. And that's to adjust our rest periods. We talk a lot about grazing, but maybe we need to flip it to thinking about how long we can rest a pasture and why that's important. So if we think about how plants will grow, really all plants, whether they're annual grasses on our rangeland or improved grasses in our irrigated pasture, are going to have three phases of growth. In phase one, that's when the plants have just germinated or we've just removed all the leaf material through cutting hay or through grazing. And at that point, we have fewer leaves. And those leaves are really a solar panel, right? That's how the plant captures solar energy and converts it into carbohydrates. At that point, we have slower recovery because the plant can't generate enough energy from the solar panels it's got. We have fewer and less vigorous roots, in part because the plant has to draw energy out of the roots in order to start growing again. Or if it's just germinated, it's drawing energy out of the energy stored in the seed. That new grass is really nutritious. If we've watched cows or sheep go on to pasture that's just germinated, boy, it's highly palatable and highly nutritious, but there's simply not enough of it there. And at that point, I kind of think of it like those old Miller Lite commercials. It tastes great to the cows, but it's not enough to fill them up. Probably showing my age a little bit here. But that's definitely a factor. When we've just germinated, we don't have enough forage there to fill up the animals' digestive systems. Phase two starts at the point where those leaves are generating more energy than the roots are drawing out. And it goes up to the top point, and we'll talk about phase three there, but that's really the point where we've got lots of leaf area. We're capturing lots of sunlight. They're very efficient solar panels at that point. Depending on the time of year when we've grazed those plants, they're going to recover rapidly from that grazing. They're going to grow very fast. The root system's also growing at that point because we're capturing more energy than the leaves need. And so we're able to put growth into the root system, which helps for soil health, helps for our nutrient uptake, and really helps in terms of the health of the whole system. It's highly nutritious, and we've got lots of it. And that's kind of like being a kid in a candy store. One of the most satisfying things to me in the springtime is turning animals onto fresh pasture and just watching their grazing behavior. It's almost like they sense that things are really good at that point too. Phase 3 comes after that phase where we've got into rapid growth. And at that point, the plant is really too big to capture enough energy during the day to replace the energy it loses at night. On our annual rangelands, no matter how much rest we're given, we're going to get to the point where all of those plants go into phase 3 because they're going to have to reproduce. The higher leaves might shade out the lower or middle leaves. If you've been in an irrigated pasture that's kind of rank and overgrown, and you look up under those bunch grasses, you're going to see a lot of dead material under the growing parts of the plant. And that's really indicative of a phase 3 stage of growth. We're also going to have something called lignification happening. And if you notice on your unirrigated rangeland, when those plants are headed out or starting to go to seed, you start getting more cellulose material in the plant stalks. And that reduces the digestibility of the plants and reduces some of the nutritional value as well. We've got lots of leaf material at that point. If you look at old dry feed this time of year, we got lots of standing dry feed, but it's very low in nutritional quality. And at this point, you can have lots of grass, but unless you're paying attention to the nutritional intake, the animals aren't getting enough value out of that. So based on that, how should we graze? What does this mean in terms of matching our rest period to the growth phase of the plant? If we start grazing when the plants get upwards of that phase 2, so before they're starting to produce seed heads, but we've got, depending on the species, 6 to 15 inches of grass growth in an irrigated pasture, maybe more than that on our annual rangeland. We want to graze there. And then we want to stop grazing before we get down to this bottom end of phase 2. We want to stop grazing when there's still enough leaf area that we're going to get some regrowth. On irrigated pasture, depending on the time of year, that may be 3 to 5 inches of stubble height. But we want to stop there and then provide enough rest until those plants have regrown to that top phase. That's, I think, a really critical point that can be also part of training your eye. How do you know when you've grazed enough, and how do you know when you can come back? Part of that has to do with the time of year. So when are we most likely to see really slow growth in our pastures or on our rangeland? Anybody got a thought on that? I'm going to pick on Joe. When do you see slow growth, Joe, in your pastures?
See slow growth either when ET on irrigated pasture is extremely high, or early in the growing season on winter rangeland, probably more like that January, February, where we've reached germination, but then not quite warm enough for rapid growth.
Absolutely, and it's really when it's either too cold, either air temperature or soil temperature wise, or when it's too hot. We'll see those summer slumps on our irrigated pasture too. When are we likely to see really rapid growth? What time of year do we get rapid recovery? I think everybody's had experience with this, where you just can't stay ahead of the grass in the springtime, right? On our irrigated pastures, and we'll talk about this in a sec, we also see some of that as we come into the fall, after it starts to cool down a little bit again. Relative to this, I also want to talk a little bit about overgrazing, because I think this is a term that that is sometimes misunderstood. But from the standpoint of what we're talking about in this type of grazing management system, overgrazing means that we've grazed a particular plant before it's recovered from the previous grazing, okay? So it's a function of time, not animal numbers. Probably everybody on this webinar has seen a horse pasture with one horse in it that's absolutely overgrazed. And that's not a function of the one horse. It's a function of the fact that none of those plants ever get any rest from that horse chewing on them. Overgrazing, therefore, can occur in two different ways. We can stay too long and get a second bite of a plant before it's recovered, or we can come back too soon. And this is, easy to do when we're in the midst of the hottest part of the summer, and our rotation on our irrigated pastures to come back every 20 days. At some point, we're going to start impacting the health of those plants. They just can't recover in that short a time period. A couple of notes on irrigated pasture versus rangeland. And those of you that are already managing both types of forages, I think will have a pretty good understanding of this, but I wanted to add this as well. On our foothill rangelands, most of the plants, most of the forage are either naturalized or native grasses and forbs, like clover. In the foothills here, most of them are going to be introduced annuals. We have very few of our foothill rangelands that still have a large component of native grasses, although there are places that is happening. We're going to have rapid growth in the spring, but mostly we're dormant in the wintertime, and we're going to be dormant as soon as those grasses dry out and die in the late spring until we get a germinating rain. During that rapid growth phase in the springtime, our rest periods seem to average between 25 and 30 days, roughly. But during the slow or no growth phases, those rest periods may be as long as 150 days. If we had had a germinating rain the 1st of October and we had grazed some of that fresh grass come November 1st, it's probably going to be 60 to 75 days before that grass is regrown enough to provide nutritional value. As a rule, and this varies from place to place, but as a rule, we find that our carrying capacity on foothill range is one cow-calf pair per 15 to 20 acres per year. What that means is it's going to take 15 to 20 acres per cow per year if you're not feeding hay. And so that's one of the ways we can kind of come up with a feed budget for that. Germination in the fall takes at least 3/4 of an inch of rain and a follow-up rain within 10 to 14 days to really get the grass started. I've heard that Judd Tripp has been doing a rain dance the last 10 days. And Judd, it's not working yet. Maybe try something different. On our irrigated pasture, we've got improved perennial grasses and forbs. Irrigated pasture technically is planted. It's not just putting water on our annual rangeland. Typically, it's planted maybe every 20 years. It's not something you have to replant every year because they are perennial grasses and clovers. Joe, I think, will provide a little insight on some things he's experimented with in that regard. We tend to have rapid growth in the spring and then a rebound of rapid growth in the fall, not maybe quite as rapid as we get in the springtime, but we tend to see a little bit of a rebound in September and October. Our irrigated pastures typically are dormant in the wintertime, and then we have that slump in July and August when it's so hot. During rapid growth, 21 to 30 days, depending on the forage type and the productivity and the irrigation system, is probably sufficient. In that July and August phase, at least on a lot of the pastures that I see, we're probably more like 40 days and maybe as much as 50 days to get enough regrowth. Carrying capacity is much higher, as everybody I think knows, but typically what we see here is that we can put one cow-calf pair per acre for the 6-month irrigation season. And then for those of you that are here in the foothills that are buying water by the miner's inch, if you're thinking about pasture, in July and August when it's the hottest, it's going to take 1 miner's inch for every 1 2/3 acres of pasture. So that's kind of the water budget that we look at from that standpoint. Let's go on to the third principle now. The third thing that we try to do is to use the shortest graze period possible while maintaining that adequate rest period. And why is that? If we look at a graph of forage consumption, and this has been measured Roger Ingram has measured this. Other people have measured the quantity of forage consumed. The longer the graze period, the more we drop off in terms of that daily consumption that an animal is going to make. And there's a couple of reasons for that we can talk about. But if you look at, when you turn the animals on to a fresh pasture, they're going to graze longer that first day than they will graze any subsequent day in that fresh feed. One of the reasons that's so important is that increased consumption is really going to increase our weight gains. The more they eat, the more weight they're going to put on. And that's influenced by three primary factors: grazing time, biting rate, and bite size. And that bite size is certainly influenced by the height of the grass. We find that maximum intake occurs when the pasture, and this is irrigated pasture primarily, is when the pasture is between 6 and 15 inches in height. So why do you suppose that consumption drops the longer animals are in a particular pasture? Any observations or thoughts there? One of the reasons is that it really comes down to the impacts that animals can have on a plant or on a pasture. And certainly the one we all think about is that they're going to eat it, right? That's what we're trying to get them to do, is to eat grass and convert it to muscle or fat or bone or whatever our goals are there. But we're also going to trample some of that forage. And once that forage is trampled and in contact with the ground, there's some value to that. We're going to build organic matter in our soils, but we're probably not going to consume that material once it's trampled. So the longer animals are in a pasture, the more trampling effect we're going to get. And yes, I realize this is not a cow pie, and I realized I didn't have a good picture of a cow pie about 5 o'clock this afternoon. So I guess I could have emailed Joe and asked him to take a picture, but I feel kind of weird asking people to take pictures of cow manure. But this is another impact. And if you look at where your animals are grazing, they're going to avoid the area around those manure pats and around where they've urinated. And that can impact the amount of forage available in a pasture as well. The next thing that we want to think about is using the highest stock density possible. And that's really the number of animals per area. It's different than our stocking rate in that it does not include time. So here's two pastures with the same stocking rate. The stocking rate is 100 animal days, but our density is much greater in that second pasture, right? Both cases we're harvesting that 100 stock days, but our density is 100 animals per acre there versus 1 animal per acre. So there's a couple of ways that we can increase stock density. One is we can add animals, but if we're already at our carrying capacity, that's probably not a really useful tool. The second way, and this is particularly useful on irrigated pasture, is to create more paddocks. And I think Greg's got some experience with that he'll share with us here in just a few minutes as well. The greater the stock density we have, the more uniformity we're going to get in grazing. And that's important for a couple of reasons. One is, like those horse pastures that we've all seen, the horse is going to start by eating all the good stuff that it likes. And if it doesn't have to eat the stuff it doesn't like, pretty soon we've got weeds and no grass. The other piece of that is that we can encourage increased consumption, because it's like when I go to a potluck dinner. If I'm the only person in line, I'm just going to go through and pick the stuff I like to eat. But if I know there's a lot of people ahead of me and a lot of people behind me, and I'm not going to get seconds, I'm going to take a little bit of everything. And the same principle works with cattle or with sheep. The kind of the perspective I think that's going through the animal's mind is, well, if I don't eat this plant, my neighbor's going to get it, so I better eat it. And we can really improve our uniformity of consumption by increasing our stock density. The last element really gets to kind of the efficiency of this type of operation, and that is to use the largest herd size possible, consistent with sound animal husbandry practices. So I know a lot of us during certain times of the year may be running heifers separate from cows, and certainly we don't have the bulls running typically with the cows all the time. But as much as we can, using that largest herd size really optimizes our efficiency. It optimizes the grazing impacts that we're trying to have, so we can do the amount of trampling that we need to do for soil health. We can optimize the grazing consumption. It optimizes our labor efficiency, which is another important factor, whether it's a part-time or a full-time operation. And then it really helps us with pasture rest too. If we've got one group that we're moving through a particular set of pastures, we can manage the pasture rest more easily than if we're trying to manage two groups and figuring out where group A goes versus group B. So with that, let me check and see in the chat if there are any questions. Anybody have any questions at this point before we jump into talking with Greg and Joe? Anybody have questions they want to share out loud? All right. Well, I would ask Joe and Greg to come back on now, and really want to start with asking both of you guys to introduce yourselves and talk a little bit about your operations. And Greg, why don't we start with you if you don't mind?
All right. Am I on? Okay, you can hear me?
Yep, you're
okay,
great.
Very good. All right. Well, my name is, like I said, Greg Lawley, and Karen and myself have lived in Lincoln since 1978. We have two ranches that we run cattle on. One is owned, about 40 acres of irrigated pasture where we live. And then we have a native grass ranch just north of Lincoln. We run, depends on the year, but somewhere between 40 and 50 mother cows a year. Again, it varies depending on what the weather conditions are. We have, well, we market our animals mainly private treaty, but if we don't get a marketed private treaty, then we'll go ahead and market them through Cattlemen's Livestock Market in Galt. I have got two herds of cattle. I have a spring calving herd that I use on the irrigated ranch primarily, and then I have a fall calving herd that primarily stays, in fact, does stay on the native pasture year-round. Let's see, what else would you want in there? I think that's about it to start with.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Greg. Joe, how about you? What? Give us a little background on your operation.
You bet, Dan. Real quick, from Ranch, I think Ranch is Jed Tripp. Actually, Jed, good question, and thank you guys. Keep putting these questions in. I promise we'll get to them, and that's a fun one. That's going to be a fun one to explore because everybody wants to know the answer to that one, and I don't know if we even have a good answer for you, but we'll get there. Joe Fisher. I manage an outfit called Bruin Ranch. It's a purebred Angus operation here in North Auburn on Lone Star Road, dead ends into a golf course. And we surround the golf course. 300 mother cows. We just switched recently to calving strictly in the fall. We used to have a late calving herd, November, December calvers, which frankly I'd contend are probably the most profitable group of cattle a cattleman can have in the foothills of California. And then of course we abandoned that because we wanted to make life harder, which I can get to that later. But we calve now starting in the 1st of August. And that's part of this business, as you all will know, because I assume most of you have been in business longer than me, you have to know your market and you have to know your endpoint, and then you start working backwards from there, and study your resources at the same time. And for us, we found that about 7% of the pasture base that we manage is actually irrigated pasture. And so how can we harness the value of that irrigated pasture to its full extent? And for our operation, it is calving in that August realm. The calves can get a good bump and a good head start when we start talking down to brass tacks on numbers, if Dan has us get there on how many acres we manage and that sort of stuff, you guys will go, wow, according to Dan, you should be running a lot more cows. But we'll talk through too how we actually fudge those numbers, and we don't get a 6-month growing season out of our irrigated pasture. We actually get more like 8, and the goal is to graze each paddock 8 times or more. And so we can get into that a little bit more. We've done some really experimental stuff, I like to think, when it comes to grazing management. We've planted some kind of edgy, more hybridized and non-native plants, frankly, that can help to complement our foothill environment and bring some a different nutrition profile to our animals other than Dallas grass and white clover and fescue and orchard grass, and trying to build that soil as much as possible. I don't, Dan, is there something I'm missing? I have 4 kids and a lovely wife. My wife has 2 kids, and been involved in this business my whole life. My family settled here in the 1850s now. I used to say 60s, found out it was in the 50s in Calaveras County. And my dad was a brand inspector working for Greg for years and years as I grew up, and also had his own cows, and has now retired and has more of his own cows. So definitely love the cattle business. I guess you'd call me a lifer to that respect. But really intrigued by looking at new techniques to improve pasture productivity and animal performance for sure.
Great. Thank you, Joe, very much. Great introduction on both ends. Greg, you mentioned this a little bit, but maybe walk us through kind of from January through December where you've got cattle, what type of feed they're on, and where they are.
Okay. Well, like I said, I run both the spring cows and the fall cows, and the spring cows from January through about June are on native pasture. We have the irrigated pasture, but every year we'll cut the pasture sometime end of May, somewhere right in there, first part of June, for hay. Give it time to recover, and then we'll bring the cows over. They'll stay here until somewhere end of October, first part of November, somewhere in there, depending on when we get rain and when we're going to have some feed coming back on the native pasture, and then they go back to the native pasture until the next spring. The fall cows are on the native pasture year-round. They calve on the native pasture. We wean the calves off, and then they're dry cows on the native pasture. So once they're there, they never leave that native pasture. I try to make sure that we have a stocking rate that's for that reason. I have a stocking rate that's probably less than what we could actually carry at an optimum level, because I want to always make sure that I have the dry feed to maintain that fall cow calving herd on. A lot of people say, well, why do you do that? Why do you keep them there? Well, one of the reasons is just the way it works out. But the other reason is we actually are on an environmental land trust property. And I was really surprised when we had a consultant come in and talk to us about the vernal pools that were on that property. And I was thinking, well, man, we've got a new landlord. They're going to come into us and say, hey, you got to do things differently than you've been doing in the past. And I had braced myself for that. We went to the meeting with the land trust and with the consultant, and the consultant said, well, whatever you're doing, don't change a thing. These are some of the best vernal pools that we've ever been able to see. So that made me feel really good that we could continue with our operation, do it the way we've done it in the past. Work within the parameters of the land trust, and so far we've been able to do that. I've been very fortunate. That particular piece of property, I've had that my cattle on that same piece of property, leased property, since 1978, and I don't know many people that are able to have the same lease property for that long. And so, even though it's not mine physically, I take care of it like it is.
Greg, just a couple of follow-up questions that intrigued me. How many acres of irrigated pasture again, roughly?
Well, I have 38 acres of irrigated pasture. The irrigated pasture is divided into 3 10s and an 8.
Okay.
And so
And do you divide it even further than that?
I do. It's solid set irrigation. We have a 30 horsepower pump that pumps out of Yankee Slough, and it goes into a 6-inch main line and then into the laterals where they start out at 2 inch and drop to 1.5 inches at the end. It's divided down the middle of the property, so we lateral off each side, east and west. When we first had the 10 acres, we just put the cows in 10 acres, we'd move them periodically. And then as I started reading a little bit more about intensive grazing, I thought, well, I need to change the way I'm doing things. So we actually divided each of the pastures in half. So then I had 5 acres and 4 acres, and we moved them. And then as I read a little more, I thought, well, that's really not probably enough. So we divide them into thirds. But now I have them into, I have 5 pastures in the 10 acres and 4 pastures in the 4 acre, or in the 8 acre pasture. So each of the little paddocks that I have are approximately 2 acres each. We never irrigate through our cattle. We always move them ahead or behind the water. We move them every 2 days so that they're always moving. It takes about 38 days to get around the cycle. From the time they get here until they leave, they probably go around about 4 times.
Okay. And how much acreage on the native pasture?
On the native pasture, there's about 450 acres total. Also, it was when we first started, it was into 3 large parcels. One's 160, one's about 100, and one was somewhere in the neighborhood of probably 120. And then we have 2 40-acre parcels also. So talked to the land trust, talked about doing some rotational grazing there, and we went ahead and split all of those pastures again too. So now we have 2 80s, we have a couple of 60s, 3 or 4 40s, and a 50, a couple of small ones of about 20 each. So
Okay.
we have able to also rotate those animals around too.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Joe, how about your cycle? Where are the cattle? Kind of what's the ratio of annual range to irrigated pasture? How many different parcels?
So I don't think I can count that high with these socks on. I know I can't actually, but it's interesting. Greg brought up the 2-day move thing. I think I've found that when you take into account labor and you take into account resources, it seems like much smaller than 2-day moves gets very difficult out here to see both the pasture improvement, the animal performance, and then also the labor you have to trade off for that. But then if you extend beyond those 2-day moves and you push those cattle harder, and especially smaller paddocks like a 2-acre paddock, the animal performance just seems to yo-yo too much and you just don't see it. So I'm glad Greg brought that up, and I'm not sure that anybody caught that. I'm sure you all caught it, but I just wanted to underscore that a little bit, because we have found if you can, especially on irrigated pasture, if you can get those moves down to about 2 days, you'll see all kinds of ecological benefits, grass growth benefits, and then also you'll see animal performance benefits as well. So Bruin Ranch, in Bruin Ranch proper, for all aims and purposes, let's just say it's 4,000 acres at the headquarters here. It's a little bit less, but between what we own and lease, and then irrigated here would be about 40 acres. And then we lease subsequent other pastures as far north now as Lomarica, some places in Grass Valley, and then we lease 1 vernal pool place down west of Lincoln. All told, I figured out it's right at it's between 7,500 and 8,000 acres of rangeland that we run on, and then 420 irrigated acres. So if you multiply that by, 1 to 1, I can't run 420 cows though. One thing I have going for us is, and frankly, is the cows are a lot bigger than they used to be. And if you extrapolate that out, the bigger cow is going to eat up a lot more. And so we're probably looking at more like 3/4 of a cow. And then how conservatively we run, because we are full-time on irrigated after probably the 15th of May. But before that, because of how our ranches are oriented, and especially Bruin Ranch, it becomes part of our normal rotation. And so early on in the growing season, February, March, if we have enough residual feed on those irrigated paddocks, we will zip through them and try to maintain adequate residual, but try to impact those plants. We found that by impacting those plants and then also maintaining that residual canopy, we'll see more soil life. And for some reason, the irrigated pastures, I think it's just because it says my internet's unstable, and that's not shocking. I apologize. I'll try to hold still here. But where there's more pasture life, there's more warmth. And so on the native rangeland, there's not as much canopy. It's colder. The cattle have eaten a lot of that dry feed. There's not as much insulation from the elements, and there's not as much pasture life in February. But you still have those fully functioning ecosystem processes, albeit they are slower on the irrigated paddocks. And so we'll hit those sometimes in February, but we hit them pretty good in March. And we have kind of a take half, leave half rule, just because my employees aren't terribly educated in the field of rotating, and it's hard to educate people. And just when you get them right, it's time for them to move on. But we like to early in the season impact those plants a little harder than that, so that we get a little bit more uniform stand of grass to start with. Frankly, we don't spray ditches, and so it gives us an opportunity to see where our ditches are and see where water's moving and those sort of things. We would calve, like I said, in about August. We breed for the first August. That's what I'm doing right now. I bred 25 cows before I came here, and then we'll go through this, and I'll go breed another 15. But we'll wean calves into May. We'll take 205-day weights because we're a purebred operation. We'll take those about the 15th of April. But because if we're getting our pop of feed right then and we've got such a bolt, the cheap gain is right there, and those calves just do so well on the side of their mothers. And plus, frankly, we'll lose so much productivity in our cows because we've been really passionate about matching our environment with the type of cow that we have. If I don't leave those big calves on those cows, they'll get too fat and we'll lose too much productivity in them. And so those cows, they will, we don't leave them on native rangeland year round. Definitely would like to leave them longer on the vernal pools. Greg, I have a question for you though. Do you have wells on the vernal pools, or do they have to drink out of the vernal pools?
I do have a well and I have water troughs, but they're going to drink wherever they are. So if there's water in the water trough, if they're out at the vernal pool, they're going to drink the vernal pool. But they will, when the vernal pools start drying up, then they do move to the water troughs. And so
I've noticed animal performance when it seems like the vernal pools need the most impact in that May, June-ish range as it's starting to go, and that water gets muddy and the animal performance just goes all to pot, it seems like. But maybe I'm wrong, and if we had some different water, we would probably do a better job of managing that piece of property, frankly, or we do a better job of being stewards to the animals. So right about the first part of May, those cattle would leave the vernal pools and they'd come up onto irrigated pasture here somewhere in the foothills. And then right now, this is something we've talked about ad nauseum with NID. Do we turn on water early? Do we leave it on late? Well, lately with the patterns of rain, we need NID water all the time, it seems like, and PCW water all the time. And right now we still have all of our cattle on irrigated pasture, and because of how we manage our cattle now and the great help that I have, we're moving on to pastures right now that have knee-high forage still. And that residual is not worth a lot. We still have to supplement those cattle, but it is feed. It is a bite for them. And the real sweet spot is they aren't eating up our forage bank that's out in the native woodland too.
So we kind of talked a little bit about the spring flush, and maybe we'll come back to that, but I think there's some other pressing questions I want to get to. Greg, you said you do hay in the springtime, right? On your irrigated pasture?
Correct.
Do either one of you fertilize your pastures? And if you do, how do you measure the cost versus the benefit?
Well, I'll go ahead and start. I do fertilize the irrigated pasture. I don't fertilize the native feed. It's interesting because I've fertilized every year, I think, except one. and I definitely saw a difference in the pasture the year I didn't, both in the quantity and quality of the hay and of the grass for the cattle the rest of the year. So I have made it a practice to make sure that I do fertilize. I've been fertilizing as a normal practice about 150 pounds of 3115O for almost every year. Last year, through a calibration error on my part, I ended up about 250 pounds per acre. And I think I was telling you earlier, Dan, that I actually think that I've seen the grass hold up better this year than it has in the past. I didn't get as much of that slow growth in those hot months of July, August that I had seen in the past. I still get the dry spots where the sprinklers don't quite cover as much as it should, but it did make somewhat of a believer out of me that 150 pounds isn't enough. Probably 250 is too much, but I probably should be somewhere in that neighborhood of maybe 200 pounds to the acre to make sure that I'm getting the amount of fertilizer that it needs to be utilized by the pasture.
Do you look at the economics of that, Greg? Do you kind of measure the cost of the fertilizer versus how much extra feed you think you'll get?
I do. Fortunately for me, last year when I did the 150 pounds, the fertilizer was about $620 a ton. This year when I did the 250, it was only but 520. So there's $100 a ton difference, which actually was beneficial. Had it been the opposite, I probably would have said, no, there's no way that I could justify doing that. But I think because fertilizer had dropped in price, that it made it economical to do it. But I think you always have to look at that. You have to vary the amount of fertilizer you use with the potential growth you're going to get versus the cost that it's going to take to put it on.
Absolutely. Joe, how about you? Do you fertilize either pasture or range?
I do not. I've chose to. Well, so I do. Yeah, I do. But we actually horse traded with Marge Carmen. If any of you happen to have the pleasure of knowing Marge Carmen while she was still around, just fantastic lady. And we horse traded a couple cord of wood for an old fertilizer she had, and we started composting mainly. Just to be frank among friends, it was a way for us to get rid of corral manure. And so we have a compost pile, and then we started putting it on the paddocks and just the irrigated. We don't get rangeland. I do think that there are more things I could experiment with when it comes to enhancing forages using machinery if we had a little bit better topography for it. And frankly, we've got a lot of rocks. You could flip over a tractor and die in a lot of our fields. And so that part is really kind of worrisome, and it was always worrisome, the timing. And then also, I would say we have 13 acres out of that 420 that is not wild flood. And so the ability to really get water back on that, if you don't have the rain coming, has been kind of was in the past problematic for us. So we just found the compost to be a little bit more flexible for our needs. And then it was serving two purposes. But we have spent our money on planting additional forages. And we've done some forage mixes with some brassicas, some radishes, some taprooted things, because we really should try to farm some of these fields. And I know we could argue about that. Like, I mean, are we going to release more carbon by putting a chisel in the ground or less or whatever? But to break up the compaction, we chose that we'd grow radishes instead of growing rocks and using a ripper or something. We would grow a lot of rocks.
And that's on your irrigated pasture, Joe?
That's on our irrigated pasture. Now, the big plan, Dan, this year was we have some sites that would be really fun to do a fall seeding of some brassicas and some additional forages on rangeland. And we actually have the paddock set up for it. We kind of skinned it off all summer. It's a fire danger thing for us around the golf course. And so I said, you know what, we're going to plant all that in brassicas and kind of study it and see how much forage productivity we can create. And frankly, without it being moist out, it's just kind of hard to plant. And that's something, I mean, some of you guys and gals on Tahoe Cattlemen's or another, I know that I'm surrounded by the community of a lot of different programs. If we could figure out cooperatively how to own some sort of a range drill or something to help us interseed additional forages, as we become more competitive and as things become more expensive in California, if you plan to stay here, we're going to have to make our rangeland and our irrigated pasture more productive. And it's going to be through alternative forages. It's going to be through alternative grazing management techniques. It's going to be through alternative water application techniques. And I think that some sort of a range drill would be great. Dan, I still think we should wait to get to the smut grass question, because then we'll keep a broader audience. If we tell them the answer now, then they'll all leave and go watch it. But Jeff asked, what do you recommend weaning off fat cows? And I'm just going to prove right here that I'm a politician by nature. You have to decide what's right for your operation. And what I tell most people is you're in the business of selling pounds, but all those pounds cost you something to put on. And so one thing I've always really admired about my counter question guy, Greg Lawley, is that Greg always has a good handle on the economics of his operation and what each one of his management techniques costs. I probably don't as well as I should, but like I said, if you know that the market is hot and they've got feedlot placements any day of the week for 800 pounders and you have 6s and they need those, well, do you really want to sit and continue to eat up your feed and sell 800 pounders later that are going to be competing on the same placement as the 600s that are selling right now? Probably not. You want to move those 600s. But Jeff, I'm not qualified to talk about stuff like that. You probably need to get a hold of Don and figure out if Judd can get on the phone and talk to you, because that every time I've tried to outguess that, I've guessed the wrong way. So I kind of have to just figure what goes with my normal management technique and what kind of happens. And if we all of a sudden hear that cattle are worth a bunch of money, you bet we'll haul stuff in and sell it. But for the most part, we don't try to outthink the ebbs and flows of the market.
Let me ask both of you guys this, because I think it gets to the nutritional status of the cows. Do you look at body condition score on your cows in relation to where they are in pastures? Is that something that you look at consistently and make any decisions about at weaning or at breeding?
It's not something I look at consciously. It's something I probably should, but it's something I may look at it subconsciously and do it, but not consciously. I don't.
Okay.
I would say that mine's mostly subconscious, Dan, and we're such a different deal. I'll rawhide these cows pretty good, and you've seen that. I mean, especially the cows at Loma Rica. But then, frankly, marketing is what floats our boat at Bruin Ranch, and it's something that really pays the bills. And we have people from all over the world that fly out here to look at cows. And so there's some cows that are in a better body condition score than they probably should be. But you know, most people don't want to pay $40,000 for a bull whose mother looks like a scarecrow. And frankly, that's become, and I'm not saying we sell a bunch of them for $40,000. That's proverbial, folks. But it has become a part of our operation. That's for sure. Something to think about. So do I think it's a tool? Absolutely. You should body condition. If I was a commercial guy in Placer County, I would be body condition scoring my cows and I would be weighing my calves. And if Judd would get on here, that's what he'd tell you. He'd say, the only things that cost you money are shrink and interest. Those are the biggest costs of money. Is that right? Biggest costs to an operation are shrink and interest. And did I copy that okay?
Yep.
Gotta weigh your cow. Know what they weigh. Know what they weigh and know what percentage of it is fat and what percentage of it is muscle, and then make your decisions accordingly.
So I want to ask you, go ahead, Judd. Did you have something to add there? Or Greg? Greg?
Go ahead, Judd.
You want me to say something?
I thought you were going to talk. I think Greg's got something.
I got a story for you.
Hold that thought for just a second.
All right.
Something Joe said that made me think. The one thing I do, and it goes back to my purebred days of registered cattle, is that I do weigh every calf at weaning. I weigh every mother at weaning. I weigh every calf at birth. So I track all of that. I know which cows are racially doing the job for me, which ones aren't, so I can move those cows out of the herd. And I think that if you have the ability to do that, I think that's one of the best tools that you can do to maintain your herd at a higher level than trying to remember what Cal 208 had for the last 3 years. If you have it on paper and you've kept a record of that, it makes it a lot easier to look back and say, no, 208 hasn't done a good job. She needs to go to town.
That's a good point. Really good point.
And I've also found, Greg, that you're probably not as guilty as me, but we know these cows too good sometimes, and 208 might have some personal affinity to us, and we realize she's actually an anchor to the business. And then there's 407, who we've never liked since birth, and we find out she's the most profitable cow we've got. And so you don't know that unless you and I think that that's probably a good first step in these webinar series, is just educating us all to be better stockmen and stock people, and just really measuring and documenting the performance of our operation.
I had an old cowman down in Madera County one time. We were talking, and he told me, he says, I don't know this for a fact, but he says, I honestly believe that if my dad was taking the cattle into the corral and he had one of his calves get hit by lightning, he would ship that cow because she didn't wean a calf that year. Boy, that is tough. But maybe that's what you have to do.
Judd, what were you going to share with us?
I have a 11-acre pasture that's winter pasture, and I've had it for 25 years. And I weigh the cattle individually going out there. I weigh 7 head. That's what it'll take. And the worst gain I ever got on that place was 145 pounds per head. The best gain I ever got on it was 356 per animal. That's the difference in the year and the difference in the nutrition because of the year. And that's the thing that's the problem with these winter pastures, is sometimes you can't tell what they're going to gain. And I've gone out there as early as November 1st and stayed until May 15th, and I've gone out there as late as February 1st. So that's the difference in your ground.
Yep.
And I hear these guys talking about 3-acre ground and 25-acre ground. And what that means is you can turn a yearling out on this ranch, and then on 3 acres of winter feed, they'll gain 350 pounds. That would be down here in the San Joaquin Valley and east. You go to Orland and north, those guys will run 20 acres per yearling and get 125 pounds gain. So that's the thing that you're talking about. What is the return on your ground? And you've got to be careful when you go to these places, because somebody might lie to you about how many cattle you can run on that place. And I like the fact that Greg runs less than he should, because you don't have to have good fences when you do that.
That's the thing about the sheep business. There's never been a sheep invented that would contain a hungry sheep.
That's right.
Same with cows, I think, too.
You know, when I came up here in 1979, the old boy that has the ranch over here is being developed. Everybody thought he was an old nut. And he weighed every calf when it was born, commercial herd, and he put the tag in the calf here the same number as its mother, so that he could, when he was driving around, he could identify which cow belonged to which calf. And the other thing he did, he weighed every calf individually, and if that calf didn't weigh the average of the whole bunch, that mother went. Now that's pretty tough on a cow herd. And everybody thought he was a nut, and I thought he was pretty smart. The other thing he did is he never sold any heifers. He would breed all the heifers and then preg them, and they would replace the cows at either 9 years old or older, or the ones that didn't raise a calf that was at the average weight. He had the biggest weaning weights in the county, and everybody thought he was a nut, and I thought he knew what he was doing. And I don't know very many people do that, but I did that on the place that I've got. And the first thing I learned is that big fat pretty cow had the sorriest calf in the range.
Yeah.
And that's the thing that it teaches you. And I said, that thing got to go. But anyway, that's a couple of stories that I've had.
Thank you, Judd. And I think we've got time for one more of these questions, and I think we should spend some time on Judd's question on smut grass. But Greg, how often do you plant your irrigated pasture?
Actually, one time. I planted my irrigated pasture when we bought the place in 1983, and I've never planted it again. So it's been the same pasture since that time. So.
And you never plant anything on your range ground, right?
Nothing's
the land
planted
trust.
on the ground.
Okay.
It's a native grass.
Joe, tell us a little more about what you planted this last year on your irrigated pasture. You said brassicas, and I think you planted.
Yeah, I planted a cocktail that we made that were hunter brassica, which is basically a cross between a mustard and I believe a turnip, or it looks like lettuce growing in your field. Big leafy material, which if you look up the nutritional analysis will rival corn and alfalfa. So it's really, really intriguing to use that, but it does take a lot of water, and you have to have the ability to apply a lot of water. If those of you that have any sort of anybody that has any sort of solid set irrigation, K-line irrigation, I'd really encourage that, because the soil life that it creates and the diversity of forages available is unbelievable. We also mixed in some Sudan grass, some Japanese millet, some cowpeas, and we've even tried alfalfa and haven't successfully put that together. It seems like our paddocks that are auburn clay loam have trouble. I think it's acidity, and there's something with the soil fertility there that is really difficult to establish some of these different forages. Whereas our bloomer loam, you can plant anything there and it'll grow. I think I could grow lettuce on some of those fields, like the Salinas Valley. But yeah, it's so hard to really study the economics of it. I just want to grow pounds of feed. I want to have more forage available. And when you start talking to guys in the valley that grow Sudan grass, and you see, they use words like we irrigated it 3 times. Well, in the foothills, we don't really have that, right? We have to irrigate in Auburn, we have to irrigate closer to 5 times per graze. I think that would be correct. Is that about right for you, Dan?
It's about right. Yeah. Yeah.
So you might even be on yours. You might be more like 10 days before you get back in some spots.
We're 10 to 14 days on our irrigation.
14, yeah. So 3 to 4 irrigations, and you can be back on a 30-day rest period.
Yeah.
So we try to get water on every 7 in ours, and we typically do pretty well at that. That was a long way to answer on additional forages, and we need to fix because I probably need to go too. So I'm sorry.
No, that's great. I want to ask Greg, what's the variety of forages in your pasture? What do you got growing?
Primarily, it's a ryegrass, orchard grass, Dallas grass, and then for a legume, it's bird's foot trefoil. And then I didn't plant clover, but clover has infiltrated from whatever sources that might be, birds or irrigation water. So got some clover in it, but primarily those 3 grasses.
Okay. And just a word of caution, I think Sudan grass can be a great forage. Johnson grass is related. Once it's frozen, whether it's Sudan grass or Johnson grass, it is toxic. So if that's something you're thinking about doing up here where it gets a little colder, that's something to watch too. We've got some great questions coming in. Why don't we go to these questions, unless either one of you have anything to add. One of the questions is, how often do you apply compost, Joe? I think you're muted.
No, you muted me. I'm muted.
Now you're good.
Sorry, Kristen, I replied to you on here, but it went privately to Brian. Usually once per season. Would like to do it more, just can't produce enough compost, and it's such a hillbilly compost thing, guys. It's a big pile of manure that we try to add some organic matter to. Like I try to add some wood chippy type stuff. I try to add some hay, as much hay as I can, to add fluff to it, because if you just get solid manure, it doesn't have enough aeration in it, and we want it light and fluffy. And then we'll just, on a big pile, we flatten out the top and almost make a little reservoir with the tractor. And then as it rains, that fills up like a little reservoir and it trickles down, and then it gets hot. And anytime I see grass growing on it, I take the tractor and I turn it. Now, should I probably put a sprinkler there in the summertime? It'd probably make it better compost, I assume. We haven't seen in our paddocks, and I think it's because they're so well established, our irrigated paddocks. We have not seen a lot of invasives come through that you could see by just using manure and not getting it to the proper temperature. And so if you don't have terribly resilient pastures, I probably wouldn't. I mean, don't take anything I do to the bank. It's not science. It just kind of works here.
And I think that's an element that's really important to keep in mind, that I think it's easy to fall into the trap of what we don't want, rather than managing for what we do want. And by that, I mean, if we're getting the grazing right, we're going to encourage the good plants to outcompete the stuff we don't like. If we're focused on getting rid of the bad stuff, that sends us down the path of using a lot of material, a lot of chemicals, or other techniques to try to manage weeds. And I think that's a hard treadmill to get off of. Competition with our desirable stuff is probably a far better approach. This other question kind of gets to that in terms of establishing pasture. Would you put seed down in anticipation of the first rain, or would you wait for the second rain and try to kill anything that germinated after that first rain?
I think we're going to have two different answers, so I'll let Greg answer it first.
Well, I only did one time, so I can tell you how I did it. I put it down before the first rain. I wanted to get it in. I wanted to try to get it established. At that point, I hadn't put in the irrigation system yet, so I didn't have any other way to germinate it other than the rains. And I didn't want to take the chance on it getting too wet and I'm not having a chance to get it in. So I put it in then. Once we got it established, then we came back in and slip plowed all the lines in and put the main line in.
Joe, how about you?
So my answer for that one is it depends on where you're at. If you have 14-foot class 1 soil in Dixon, California, you're probably going to kill all the competition and put in permanent pasture, and it's going to be more productive pasture than I've had on stuff that's been established for 25 years. So here, though, I've really taken the approach that life is life, and we want life in our pastures. We want fertility in our pastures. And so I would plant it as soon as I can, try to get some germination, and then yes, it's going to be outcompeted by the annuals that come along, absolutely. But that seed will stay there, and then as those annuals tend to go, if you keep applying that irrigation, then you'll see that stand start to take off. And I think that's probably what I said is probably the long game. And Dan, if I said anything incorrect, just please stop me. But that's the long game. The shorter game would be to napalm it all and then create this race for your new planting. But I feel like it's better for the overall fertility of your entire ranch to just do it slow and like Greg had said, plant it early and just start irrigating.
There's a couple of thoughts that I would add to that. I think if you're able to irrigate a site before you've planted and you can get some things to germinate and then get a good kill in what's germinated, that may be a viable approach. But if you're relying on precip to get germination on a planted irrigated pasture, you can't afford not to get seed down in that first rain. And I think one of the things we've realized with the pastures that we've got here in Auburn is that, we didn't get a perfectly uniform stand in the first year or the second year. But as we've managed for what we want, as we've managed to get more orchard grass and more fescue and more clover, those weed issues that we didn't control when we planted have started to diminish. And I think thinking about it over the long term rather than just the immediate issue is probably a viable approach. We've got one last question that will be in deep trouble if we don't answer, and that is, will cows graze smut grass eventually? And all three of us have had experience with smut grass. Greg, why don't you start with your observations on that one?
They will graze it if that's all they have to eat. I've seen it on pastures where I think you damage your pasture by getting it to that point. All the grasses that you're trying to promote, if you try to get your cows to eat the smut grass. Once it starts getting stemmy and goes to seed, I haven't had any luck at all with cattle even wanting to touch it. So in my case, I have not had any luck. Although, like I said, I have seen other pastures where people have overgrazed it and they will eat it.
Joe, what's been your experience?
Cows will eat paint off a building if you make them hungry enough. But I do think one thing with smut grass is I actually think it's not scientific. I'm probably wrong. I think it's in the same family as like endophyte fescue. And if you see cattle that have really been on the smut grass hard because they've been pushed to have to eat a lot of it, you'll start to see extremity issues. Cattle with shorter tails, cattle with some foot issues, cattle with fertility issues, just a decrease in thriftiness. I think there's some subclinical stuff that'll go on there if they're consuming too much smut grass. The only way we found smut grass is hilarious. It's not funny. It is funny though. It's sort of like star thistle. We spend so much time focused on it. I remember this patch of star thistle in San Andreas. I grew up in Calaveras County, and it's right by this little, there's a little Chinese cemetery up on a hill. And you drive along and see grazing everywhere and no star thistle. And then right here on the side of the road is a patch of 5 acres of star thistle. And I mean, it's like waist high thick. And they've sprayed Transland. They've sprayed Roundup. The county spent oodles of money trying to control this little patch of star thistle, and it just keeps growing there, which my thought is just leave it alone. It's not spreading, and I mean, it's not getting worse. So what's it matter? I think smut grass is much the same. I think that if you don't change your management practices to enhance other varieties of species, you will continue to see smut grass proliferate in a pasture. Now, Judd, the one thing I'm disappointed in is you asked about smut grass and you didn't ask about barbed goat grass or Medusa head, because those two little gems will cause us quite a bit of problems in the native ground as well. And that one, I actually found less problems with smut grass than I have with Medusa head. I've actually seen Medusa head. I think it's the silica content in it or something that cattle will actually do poorer on that than if they're eating Medusa head. So again, it's manage for what you want, not worry about the smut grass. And the best way to do that is find competition for smut grass, which brings me back full circle to where Dan was hand feeding it to me and I didn't take it. Sudan grass will compete at the exact same time where smut grass really takes off, where evapotranspiration is at its highest, where day length is at its highest, where heat index is at its highest. That's where those warm season grasses, really we have no competition for them other than Dallas grass. And Dallas grass will create a big canopy, but you see there'll be places in between the individual plants, right? And usually that's filled in with white clover because that comes in every single mixed bag of non-bloat pasture that you can get from Farm Supply or Echo Valley or anywhere. Well, the cattle will go and they'll nub down the white clover and leave these spaces, and then pretty soon the smut grass comes in. At least that's my theory. But you have any other thoughts on smut grass, Dan?
Yeah, just a couple of things to add in terms of getting rid of it too. I think one of the things that we're finding when we look at smut grass is that it is a warm season grass, and it seems to be favored by inefficient irrigation and bare ground. So if we've got bare ground in a pasture in a place where we maybe can't get quite enough water there in July and August, that's where we're going to see the smut grass get a foothold. The other challenge with smut grass is that it produces so many of those tiny little seeds. All of us are hydroseeding every time we irrigate. in July and August with smut grass seed. And I think having something that we can outcompete it with in that warm season period where we've switched from orchard grass and fescue really growing fast to Dallas grass or Sudan or Johnson grass. I think we need to find something that'll fit that niche and outcompete it. But until we address the water issue, the irrigation issue, I think we've got a real challenge there. Judd, you had a question?
The 11 acres that I have a winter feed, I was telling where I weighed the cattle on and off. When I went over there 25 years ago, it had star thistle all over it. It has very little today. And I don't know why.
It's because you're grazing it at the right time.
Well, thank you. I wondered why. The other thing is I do not wait till the grass is dry. I leave about 10 days before the grass is completely dry.
And that's part of the star thistle value there too, I think.
And one of the reasons why I do it is if you stay too long, the cattle get pink eye. Now they're worth 20 cents a pound less.
Yep.
You know, one of the issues that I have on the native pasture, and it seems to have gotten worse over the years, is tarweed. And I don't know if anyone else has that issue or not, but once it gets started, the cattle walking through it has a sticky residue, great for face flies because you don't have any face flies, but it also transmitted from where it is to other places, and it takes off. It's pretty prolific.
You know, I think there's some real need for us to do some research with different varieties of both rangeland plants and pasture plants, given the change in our precipitation regime. I mean, if you think about the way it rained here 15, 20 years ago versus what our rain patterns are like now, I think that's encouraging some of these broadleaf weeds that we didn't see before. You look at last May, we got 3 or 4 inches of rain in May after a dry April, and that's had to have had an impact on what our rangelands grew late in the season. So any last thoughts? Go ahead.
As we wrap, I feel like this is kind of, because Greg and I always do stuff like this, it's kind of turned into more of a general beef cattle production webinar. Because that's what everything we do, right? I mean, everything is generally tied in. So whether you're new or old to the business, and I'm sure that some of you have been here longer than me are already going to know this, I keep this by my bed table. Lassiter Philosophy to Cattle Raising is a fantastic book. It covers genetics, environmental adaptability. It covers grass management. It covers proper infrastructure. It covers economics. Especially if you're new to the business, it's a book it's a great read. It's an easy read, and it keeps me grounded when I'm talking about embryo transfer and flushing cows and marketing high dollar bulls. But if we don't take care of how we manage cattle like they're supposed to be managed and get rid of the lemons and keep the good ones, then we aren't doing anything right.
I think that's a great point to end on. Thank you, Joe, and thank you, Greg. Really outstanding tonight, and I really appreciate your expertise tonight. We've got another workshop next Thursday, a week from tonight, on beef cattle nutrition. Be sure to check that out, and I will be sending the web link to this to everybody hopefully tomorrow. But thank you all, and have a great night. Thank you.